Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. We have apologies this morning from Colette Stevenson and Michael Mara, and I also welcome Sarah Boyack to the meeting. Very welcome as always, Sarah. Agenda item 1, our first item of business is to decide whether to take items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Agenda item 2. Our next agenda item is our third evidence session on the Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Scotland Bill. I welcome to the meeting Jenny Munro, Policy, Practice and Research Officer of the Royal Town Planning Institute Scotland, Duncan Thorpe, Policy and Public Affairs Manager, Social Enterprise Scotland, Emma Hunter, Policy Officer, Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland, and Ellie Twist, Co-Convener, United Kingdom Environmental Law Association. Thank you all of us for helping us with our consideration of Sarah Boyack's Members' Bill. And we will go straight to questions. And it's myself that's going to start. So the policy memorandum for this piece of legislation explores the concept of policy coherence for sustainable development. So is that a desirable objective? Is this bill the best way of doing that? And do you have any other comments in relation to how we secure that policy coherence, assuming, of course, that that's a desirable thing to have? Who would like to start? Jenny. And Jenny, you've done that the right way. If no one doesn't indicate, I would pick somebody. So you indicated. Thank you. Jenny Munro.
Yeah, no, happy to start. Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I think we would broadly support that as a policy objective. Coherence is all about moving in the same direction, and that can only be a good thing. We just need to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction. And I think that's where the other details of the bill come into play to ensure that we're doing that. So, I mean, we've got comments on, for example, the definitions within the bill. There's probably going to be another question specifically on that, so I won't go into any further detail around that just now, but I would say yes, broad support for policy cohesion.
Okay, so that's helpful. Policy cohesion, yes, but the bill has to be consistent in itself with that, I think, is what I'm hearing. Other comments in relation to that? Ellie? I didn't name you Ellie. Ellie, do you wish to go first?
Thank you, Convener. UKLA warmly welcomes coherence across policy. That's generally welcomed by the courts and by lawyers all around, so I think I have nothing further to add on that.
Okay, and this bill's an opportunity to do that?
Absolutely,
okay.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you, Duncan.
I would say pretty much agree with that, and I think that policy coherence is really important. I think across other policy portfolios as well. I think it's like an emerging issue actually as well. So and in this context as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, and Emma Hunter.
Yeah, we're similarly broadly supportive of efforts to ensure that policies, consider long-term outcomes and ensure that they're not contradictory. And particularly in regards to this bill, children and young people tell us that climate change is one of their biggest concerns, so we're generally supportive of efforts to ensure policy coherence towards improving consideration of sustainable development. However, as we've noted in our evidence to the committee, we think this bill as drafted may in fact create unnecessary overlap and confusion, in particular with regards to the wellbeing definition and existing human rights duties, as well as some existing climate duties. So in our view, while the policy objectives are sound, we're not sure that the bill is likely to achieve those.
Okay, that's helpful. I'll maybe stick with yourself, Emma, for the next question, and we'll actually explore some of those areas later on in the evidence session. So the policy objectives are very desirable. I suppose the question the committee has to wrestle with is whether these can be delivered without legislation. So are there other ways of achieving those policy objectives? Because the committee's got a choice to make. Emma?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the objectives of improving consideration of sustainable development, we think there are opportunities which can be considered in terms of reform of the National Performance Framework and in terms of potentially strengthening or clarifying existing duties. There are existing duties in this area and we're aware there's kind of limited progress. So we wouldn't speak to the detail in terms of sustainable development, but I think there's definitely areas to consider there. In terms of well-being, we consider one of the fundamentals of enabling well-being in Scotland is the protection of human rights, including obviously the rights of children and young people. These protections already exist in law through the Human Rights Act, through the UNCRC Incorporation Act, and of course there's commitment to incorporate further human rights in a human rights bill. So in our view, properly resourcing the implementation of the relatively new UNCRC duties and also ensuring there's proper resourcing for any additional human rights duties is key to progressing human rights and therefore enabling progress on well-being in Scotland.
Okay, that's very helpful. Jerry, I might turn to yourself next. I think Emma had suggested that, and this was going to be my prompt question if this didn't come up, the National Performance Framework and Scotland's national outcomes, they've not really been as effective as we wanted them to be at making them work well and be more clearer, more focused and more deliverable. Might be a better way of, or not a better way, that's a kind of biased comment, could be an alternative to the legislation. Does Jen, do you have any comments on that?
I mean, I don't have any specific comments about delivering on the objectives of the bill without legislation. That's more maybe of a legal question that we're not really placed to respond to. I do think that there are opportunities here to embed the national outcomes within this legislation in order to provide them with additional support for their deliverability. I think that's definitely something that's lacking from the bill in its present form, which I think is really important.
So, Ellie, I'm sorry for picking on you now. Apparently that could be a legal matter. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually would wholeheartedly agree. Just that point of embedding, that's kind of where we stand. Yeah.
Could you just expand on that
Sure,
a little bit further? Because the underlying question was the committee will be wrestling with desirable policy objectives. Do we legislate to secure those, or are there other routes, and the National Performance Framework was one of those potential other routes?
I would say, just going back to question one as well, for policy coherence, placing these legal principles of sustainable development and well-being on a statutory footing would establish enforceable rights and corresponding obligations, which both are critical for the people of Scotland during a continually worsening climate and twin biodiversity crises. I think we need to continue to ensure that decisions are not taken with merely a short-term view, but that they also do consider impacts on future generations. Future generations will be living in a very different Scotland. That is a reality we are facing, and kind of owe it to them to ensure that we've played a role in lessening the climate-related struggles that they were faced by ensuring that legal concepts like sustainable development are placed on a statutory footing. So I would say we require this to be legislative. Yeah.
Which is helpful for the committee to hear. Duncan, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I think in terms of this particular policy area, definitely legislation is needed. I mean, you can see that in the Welsh example, really, where legislation is needed and how that's worked in Wales. I think there's a good template there, actually. But again, it's come back to that point about alignment as well with the National Performance Framework and the national outcomes. But I suppose other policy areas as well. I mean, how does this fit into community wealth building, for example? So it's just making sure that, yes, legislation, but not duplication. That's probably the key point.
Okay, Duncan, can I stick with yourself? And I'm generally not trying to contradict you, Duncan, in relation to the Welsh experience, but the evidence we've broadly had in relation to the Welsh experience is it's been positive, but 10 years in, but it's been positive more of a cultural change and more of an awareness change rather than any tangible, concrete improvements. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting the evidence. If I've got that wrong, please just tell me I've got that wrong.
No, I think that's a very fair point. A lot of this is not just about legislation of what's on paper; it's about culture change actually as well. I think that's hopefully legislation will help towards that, help that culture change. But I think you're right. It's very much about changing the way things are done, the way people think about these issues. I think that's that's what you meant.
And I'm not trying to put words into your mouth, but both yourself and Ellie mentioned putting it on a statutory footing. But is the culture change the most important aspect of this, or is it the statutory footing?
I think it's got to be both, really. I mean, I think legislation will drive the culture change to a certain extent because it's a direction of travel for policies. I think they have to both coexist. I think, really,
right,
for it to work. Yeah.
So the underlying question was about the Welsh experience. Any comments on the Welsh experience? Other witnesses, what can we learn from the Welsh experience? Have I misinterpreted the evidence we've had to date? I'm more than happy to be contradicted in that. Ellie Twist.
I think the Welsh experience offers a really great insight into how to give statutory teeth to sustainable development objectives. the Welsh Act requires public bodies to carry out sustainable development by setting and publishing these wellbeing objectives. And Wales, in their 2025 report on lessons from work under the Future Generations Act, freshly assessing how best to measure the impact public bodies are having, which is something we could really benefit from taking on board to ensure that our implementation of a Future Generations Commissioner is robust and as helpful to future generations of Scotland as it can be. There's also an interesting provision that I liked, where the Welsh Government grants a great level of autonomy to local authorities in determining area-specific wellbeing outcomes, which enables localised responses whilst maintaining national coherence. And I think that could be really potent in to address Scotland's diverse regional requirements.
Okay, and only because, Elliot, I don't want to misrepresent the Welsh situation. You mentioned that it gives teeth to the pursuit of this, and you mentioned the development and setting of plans by various public bodies. Can you give an example of where the Welsh commissioners use those teeth?
Well, absolutely. Well, they have a really great national indicators framework that provides quantifiable metrics against which progress can be assessed against. And one of the parts of that is the reporting cycles with parliamentary scrutiny. So it's that kind of parliamentary scrutiny which could be very helpful. And I suppose just going back to the previous question on the providing statutory teeth, we've done a similar thing with NPF4, a national planning framework in Scotland. We put that on a statutory footing, which strengthened alignment across Scotland's planning system and required decision makers to take time and effort into their considerations. And it kind of changed their shift away from more short-term approach to a longer-term approach. NPF is on a 2045 target, whereas a lot of local development plans are much shorter than that. So that can play a role. I'm sorry if that was unclear. I went off on a tangent there.
You went off on a very helpful tangent, Ellie. We will listen to your evidence back and we will consider it. It's all helpful for the committee to form reviews, so thank you. Emma Hunter, do you want to add anything?
Just in terms of the Wales Act, I think we would note, kind of similar to what you said, it is worth noting it is quite a different piece of legislation. That it involves sort of creation of objectives, taking concrete steps towards achieving those. So I think it's quite difficult to compare. I think one of the lessons, though, that you can take from that is, as you've mentioned, it's been in place for 10 years and it's not created a sort of system-wide change. So I think a bill which perhaps has weaker or less clear duties need to consider how effective that is then going to be if something with kind of stronger requirements and clearer kind of well-being tied to kind of objectives hasn't seen that kind of system-wide change.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, Jenny Munro.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, I think there's many positive aspects of the Wales Act that we could take forward in Scotland. Just a few examples, and these will probably come up in further questions as we move along. But the Wales Act appears to take a much stronger stance on future generations, which I think is really important. The Wales Act also seems to take a more rounded approach to the definition of sustainable development, including well-being, linking it through the 7 well-being goals rather than to set a rigid set of definitions. And I think what has been particularly helpful in Wales, just from having spoken with some of my Welsh colleagues, is the way that they've linked the definition of sustainable development with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Principle, which sets out 5 key ways of working that allow public bodies to demonstrate how they've pursued pushing forward the goals of the legislation. And I think it's collaboration, integration, involvement, long-term and prevention are the 5 ways of working. And from what I've heard from colleagues in Wales, that is brought up a lot, so that is given quite significant weight in Wales.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on now. Mary McNair.
Thank you, Convener. An interesting time, I'll be brief as well. You've don't really want to answer a question or it's not appropriate to you, please don't. I'll start with Jenny first, obviously, the definition of public bodies, the duty on public bodies. In section 1, is the definition of public bodies appropriate, and should it include all those who contract with public bodies?
I mean, we didn't really have a strong view on this, to be honest. I think the only thing that I would say is that, you know, public bodies is defined elsewhere, and I think we need to be consistent, and it comes back to that policy cohesion point that was made at the start of the session. So I think, however it's defined, it needs to be consistent with how it's been defined elsewhere. I mean, extending it out to contractors, yeah, I don't really have any strong views on that, but I would suggest that if the public body has a duty, then that would include its decision to contract out and who they choose to be their contractors. But yeah, no strong views as such.
Thanks, it's helpful though. Anyone else? We'll move on.
Yep.
Duncan?
Yeah, again, I suppose it comes back to that point about coherence again as well. So the Community Wealth Building Bill, you know, there's public bodies listed in there as well and definitions in there as well. So it's kind of like just making sure that's aligned across legislation, I think, to be honest, in terms of that point. In terms of contractors, I'm not too sure about that point, to be honest. I think that's kind of up for debate, really. But certainly the definition of public bodies kind of makes sense. But as long as it's aligned with other legislation, I think is the key point.
Thank you. I think, Ellie, you're looking to come in as well.
Same again. Just a helpful question might be, is there a reason that the definition of public bodies is not aligned with the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 definition of a public body, which is in section 44, subsection 2. And I think that follows the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, so section 3, which might be a helpful alignment to make.
Thank you. Moving on to my next question, obviously, to your written submissions from witnesses, it suggests that the duty to have due regard for the need to promote wellbeing and sustainable development could also allow adherence to something of a tick box exercise. Do you want to take the opportunity to set out any concerns you've got and how this could be addressed in the bill? I'll pop it out to anyone who wants to answer. Duncan?
Yeah, I suppose it comes back to the definition thing, so it's just making sure the definitions are very, very clear. I think that's the thing, and get the clarity around the definitions, and that kind of, it flows from there.
Cheers. Jenny?
Yeah, I can understand the concerns about tick box exercise. I mean, I suppose to have due regard, I'm just aware that also in the bill is the proposal for the Commissioner to prepare and publish guidance around what public bodies would need to do to fulfil their duties. So I think that could probably be clarified through that guidance. So we don't have any particular concerns about the have regard to aspect of the bill as such.
Thank you. Anybody else? Emma?
I think just in terms of due regard duties, obviously they are kind of inherently weaker than, for example, some duties you might find in human rights law, not to act incompatibly. So, of course, they do risk being slightly less effective in how they impact public bodies' actions. But that's not to say that they can't be effective in some ways. But again, our biggest concern here would be a sort of duplication or confusion with embedding these new kind of due regard duties. And I think, we'll come to this later in terms of there already being existing new duties around compliance with human rights, and then adding a sort of additional due regard, consider a sort of a well-being definition that loosely correlates to human rights. I think there's a risk in that of being not particularly effective.
Thanks, that was really helpful. Ellie?
Just to point out, I think we did say in our submission that to have regard to holds more procedural weight rather than substantive weight. To have regard could reduce this duty in practice to a note in a meeting minutes, which is what I'm sure we all would like to avoid. It may sound cynical, but that's how UKLA has approached this. One option to strengthen the have regard to could be to replace it with have due regard or to further. Both phrases have been interpreted by the courts. The have due regard was interpreted quite strongly in 2013 in a case Brackingham, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, which says The duty must be exercised in substance with rigour and with an open mind, not a question of, quote, ticking boxes, and it must be fulfilled before and at the time when a decision is being taken. And I think we can all agree that would be a very beneficial provision to have, to just strengthen that. And I'd also like to add, just on that, the Nature Conservation Scotland Act 2004, Section 1, creates a duty for public bodies and office holders to further the conservation of biodiversity. So that's a duty to further rather than to have regard, so far as consistent with the proper exercise of their functions. That's from 2004, and in 2023, Nature Scot released their most recent State of Nature report, which highlighted that in the 10 years prior, 43% of species have declined strongly. To quote, "This is the most precise scientific report on Scotland's nature." So at the time of this report's release, nearly 20 years on from the Nature Conservation Act 2004, we need to be looking at tangible aggregate improvements in what we can see in Scotland's biodiversity through sustainable development. And we haven't actually seen those improvements. So we have to ask, will having regard to carry the sufficient weight to actually change the practice on the ground of public bodies to the extent we need it to, so that we can not only fulfil our national strategies but also our global commitments under the global biodiversity framework. Thanks.
Thanks, Ellie. Finally, sorry to put you in the spot, Jenny, but obviously your written evidence stated the bill should support planners in the continued development of sustainable development and wellbeing, but there's a need to be mindful of the existing definitions and obligations. How might planning authorities balance these requirements if the bill goes on to be passed?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think from our point of view, it should never be about balancing these requirements, because the word balancing assumes that they're somehow in conflict with each other, when actually we think there's real opportunity for them to be working together and reinforcing each other. I mean, what we really do want to ensure is that the bill aligns with the current duties and doesn't create an additional layer of complexity that, you know, could at best have a duplicating effect, or at worst create an additional separate duty that sets different benchmarks in parallel with the duties that are already being delivered to achieve sustainable development and wellbeing outcomes, which would then require a balancing act, in our point of view, which we don't think would be helpful to anyone and certainly doesn't deliver that kind of level of policy cohesion, which is an objective of the bill.
Thank you. That's me, Convener.
Thank you. Can I just follow up briefly? And I'm in danger of putting public record my knowledge gap here. Ellie Twist, you mentioned case law earlier on about in relation to a judge enforcing what due regard should mean in practice, and that it should be substantial, meaningful and tangible, all those things. Does this bill have a judicial pathway to enforcement? Because earlier on I'd asked you about what teeth the bill had, and we hadn't mentioned any kind of judicial route. So I'm just wondering whether we can use that case law meaningfully in terms of this bill. And I'm conscious that Jenny Munro's also spoken about the bill should not give any additional duties. So therefore, the purpose of this bill, in theory, would be about enforcing what we already want to see happen. And that's why I'd asked the question about teeth. So I'm just wondering, and that comment about case law, is there a judicial route? Or what routes are there for enforcement when local authorities or public bodies are not meeting those responsibilities?
Absolutely. So a decision, if it wasn't to consider or have due regard to, as interpreted by the courts in 2013, there is a potential for a decision to be judicially reviewed. Is that sufficient?
It's just showing my ignorance, Ellie, I'm afraid. No. Who would seek the judicial review?
On that, I'd probably have to consult my colleagues back at UKLA, but I suppose those affected by the decision and involved within the decision-making process, okay. I would understand rudimentarily.
And I'm not trying to put you on the spot. If you could come back to us with some more information, that would genuinely be really helpful.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that.
Make a note.
Elena?
Thanks, Convener. I want to spend a wee bit of time discussing the definitions of sustainable development and of well-being itself. We've already touched on it this morning, and I think maybe it could have come up earlier in the process of the questions to get us kind of set out if we think about it logically. But in terms of the written evidence that we've taken from RTPI and also UKELA, there's expressed concerns about the definition of sustainable development. And I'm wondering if Jenny and Ellie could expand on that a little bit more, about the concerns you have in terms of the definition. Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, I think this relates back to the lessons that we can learn from Wales, to be honest. The Wales Act certainly does take a more nuanced approach to its definition of sustainable development, linking it with the Sustainable Development Principle, which in turn links it to the 5 ways of working and also the well-being goals as well. And we sort of see the wellbeing goals as being quite similar actually to our national outcomes, which is why we feel that there's an opportunity in this bill to embed those outcomes rather than taking a whole new approach to how we define wellbeing. The Wales Act, we know, also does use the Brundtland definition as a baseline, which we can understand, but it also goes beyond this. And takes it further, and we think that this is what we should be doing in Scotland as well. I understand that, you know, beyond the Brundtland definition, I think in the briefing paper that was provided to us in preparation of this session, it talks about the Brundtland report does include additional text that refers to planetary environmental limits. But ultimately, that's not what's been included in the bill, and ultimately the definition is going to be as it's drafted. And we think that it's insufficient in its current form. At the moment, the definition of sustainable development is very much linked to how we're defining well-being. They're tied to one another. So in that sense, it really just does come back to how we've defined well-being. And we're very concerned that limiting the definition of well-being to a set of 6 entitlements that talk about nothing about the well-being of the environment and the need to live within environmental and planetary limits is a flaw in this bill. And this is certainly where we feel the bill does fall short, particularly in terms of acting for future generations. I think that's all I have to say at this point in time. So hopefully.
Thanks very much. And from a UKELA perspective, Ellie, what's the concerns around about the definition of sustainable development?
Thank you. Yeah, very similarly aligned. We do have concerns. The Brundtland definition has been great, but we have to be conscious it is 35 years old, and we might be better to align ourselves with something that our European cousins have done by the European Environment Agency, which notes that sustainability is about meeting the world's needs of today and tomorrow by creating systems that allow us to live well and within the limits of our planet. So again, going back to those planetary boundaries, we would like to see that emphasised, and we think that would be really beneficial.
Okay, it's helpful because I think that came out in last week's evidence session as well, where the planetary boundaries and the linking that to environmental limits as well, and we heard that is something that perhaps needs to be included within the definitions. I guess in terms of the fact that right now we hear about sustainable development across many different aspects of legislation and outcomes that we're seeking, but there isn't any real definition that's agreed upon. Do you think that this would be a vehicle to actually firm up a definition, or how can we actually ensure that we collectively understand what sustainable development means? Yeah, Ellie or Duncan after? Yeah.
Simply put, yes. I think it would be very helpful to have a statutory definition. We've been using the concept of sustainable development for decades now in Scotland, and we actually have a pretty great history to be proud of in integrating the term sustainability into our legislation in the environmental context. And we were the first nation to do so, actually, in the UK, in our Natural Heritage Scotland Act 1991. So it would be great to see it put on a statutory footing, again, for a unified interpretation.
Thank you. Duncan, did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
just agree with that really. So I won't comment on the actual which definition we should choose, but certainly the consistency, just to come back to that point again, I think is really important because the narrative around a lot of this bill has been there's definitions everywhere kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons that we want this bill kind of thing, I think, is just to get that clarity. So just to re-emphasise that point again.
Thank you. And Emma, in terms of the Young People's Commissioner view about not supporting a statutory definition of well-being as set out in the bill, and I think you explained that clearly in terms of where you perhaps believe that if we incorporate all of the human rights and have a human rights-based approach that we will deliver upon well-being in that way. Could you expand on that a little bit more for us, perhaps?
Sure. I mean, the definition of well-being in the bill kind of reflects the core principles of a variety of human rights protections that are already set out in law through the Human Rights Act and UNCRC, as I've said. But in kind of more vague and general terms, we set out some examples in our written evidence. For example, at section 3.1a, it refers to personal dignity, including respect for choices and beliefs. That kind of largely reflects the right to private and family life, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and freedom of expression, which are protected in both the ECHR and therefore the Human Rights Act, as well as the UNCRC, and it also kind of reflects children's right to be heard under Article 12 of the UNCRC. So in our view, kind of existing human rights laws in Scotland provide that framework for ensuring children and adults now and in the future have their rights protected and fulfilled. And given the kind of strong accountability mechanisms that are associated with these protections, we don't think a kind of less clear and less onerous duty to promote well-being will be effective. And we're concerned that, you know, at best it's sort of confusing and at worst it actually will be unhelpful. And given the kind of recent nature of the human rights protections, particularly under the UNCRC Act, there's still a lot of embedding to be done. So we don't think it's helpful to kind of add that additional layer at this time. I think also more generally, as we've said previously, I think we consider defining well-being in legislation to not necessarily be helpful. In our view, it's more appropriate to kind of policy. It's, you know, exists kind of across the policy landscape in lots of different ways, and we think it can be useful there. We're less convinced about its definition in legislation.
And do you think that the definition of sustainable development as set out in the bill could stand alone in the absence of a definition of well-being being in it as well?
I mean, in our view, and would sort of defer to others in terms of sort of strengthening definition of sustainable development, but again, in our view, we wouldn't want it to refer to this concept of well-being. And I think if it continued to refer to the concept of well-being without well-being being defined in the bill, that would also be kind of unhelpful.
Does anybody else have any comments on any of that? Yep, Jenny?
I mean, yeah, just to say, yeah, I agree with a lot of what has been said. I think the way that the bill is currently drafted, that it couldn't, sustainable development couldn't stand alone without a definition of well-being, because that definition is intrinsically tied to how we're defining well-being. But I agree with what's been said. We don't agree with how well-being has been defined, and we think that it would be much more helpful to link it directly to the national outcomes and to actually, you know, take account and align it with what's already being done. And how well-being has already been discussed and work that's already been done around defining well-being and what we mean by well-being. And, you know, it's such a multifaceted term that means many different things to different people. So to try and rigidly define it against a set of 6 criteria, none of which we disagree with, but it goes way beyond that. And I think it's not helpful, as has already been said.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Witnesses have been clear in written evidence when it comes to support for the new Commissioner. And it would be good to get a flavour, if a new Commissioner was established, how might the new Commissioner effectively align with other Commissioners in doing that role? And maybe if I come to you, Emma, first, because you are another Commissioner.
Yeah, so we haven't supported proposals for a new Commissioner in this bill because of the concerns I've set out around the basis of the wellbeing duty and the kind of confusion that would create, but also because in our view, the new Commissioner we've had the SPCB landscape review recommendations, and in our view, it hasn't been evidence that there's a real need for this. Those recommendations specifically stated that bodies should be considered as a last resort and where there's no other effective mechanism available. And in our view on this issue, that's not been shown to be the case, and we would favour kind of greater consideration being given to the best means to embed sustainable development and strengthen existing duties. I think also, as I've kind of vaguely referred to previously, we're quite concerned about the risk of overlap with our office in this as well as that of Scottish Human Rights Commission, because of the wellbeing uncertainty that I've raised and the confusion that would cause both in exercising our statutory functions but also for public bodies trying to comply with duties and kind of demonstrate compliance.
Does anyone else have any views on that? Duncan, thank you.
Yeah, I suppose just to refer to, I think it's the Finance Committee's report into the Commissioner landscape. Actually, I think it's quite important. So they talked about a strategic approach to the Commissioner landscape, and I think that's really important, to be honest, at this stage, because we are talking about creating a new Commissioner here. We've just created another Commissioner recently as well, and there's talk about an older persons Commissioner, for example, Commissioner for disabled people. So there's lots of conversations and developments in the Commissioner landscape, and I think it's just worth stopping in a sense and just saying let's look at the whole landscape itself, and let's look at where we're at and where the duplication lies, where the overlap is, and where we can maybe merge commissioners or kind of bring them together in some other way. It doesn't have to be mergers, but some other way. I think that's really important.
And it has been said that, in the evidence we've heard already from others, that there are possibly other methods of oversight and accountability, and we heard that from the Carnegie UK last week. And do witnesses have any thoughts on options for accountability and oversight that do not require a new Commissioner? I mean, Emma, you've already said why you don't think there are, but do you think there are any options there that would require?
We don't have sort of specific proposals with regards to oversight of any sort of sustainable development duty. I think in terms of the bill as it is currently, our concerns would remain regardless of what sort of oversight mechanism existed.
Anybody else on that? Yes, Duncan?
Yeah, and I suppose the powers and the responsibilities of this proposed Commissioner, I think, should be somewhere. I would probably say that more than anything else. I think what we're trying to achieve with this bill is really, really important about future generations, but it's where does that sit, I think. So that doesn't necessarily mean creating a new Commissioner. It could just be, as I said, giving other Commissioners more powers, etc. But I think the actual what we're trying to achieve with this bill, I think, is really important.
Jenny, thank you.
I mean, at RTPI Scotland, we were broadly supportive of the Commissioner role. I mean, I take the point of others that there are potentially better ways that accountability and oversight could be undertaken and managed. And we certainly think accountability and oversight is important. I mean, I suppose in our view, whichever mechanism is used to deliver that, we think it needs to be independent, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be collaborative and visible, and it needs to act as a support to enhance awareness, accountability and scrutiny, rather than duplicating or adding to the work that's already being done by public bodies and others to deliver sustainable development and wellbeing outcomes. So if those were the principles that we're taking forward with whatever method that was decided upon, we think that's most important.
Better. And when we've seen the Welsh situation, it's the Auditor General of Wales carries out a number of these functions when they're looking at the public bodies have acted in accordance with the Welsh Sustainable Development Principles and setting out that and meet their objectives. And one examination of each public body is required within each 5-year reporting period. So can I ask, could such a mechanism be part of the landscape of Audit Scotland when you look at what's happening with the Auditors General in Wales? Emma, thank you.
Yeah, I think we definitely see potential for exploration of that option, but I think I couldn't say more with no specific view on it.
Anyone else got any views on that? No, you're content. Thank you, Convener.
Carol Markham.
Just, given what you've said, if we do have a future Generations Commissioner, I'm obviously interested to hear people's views on thoughts on the general function for the Commissioner. So it's described as to promote the well-being of future generations by promoting sustainable development by public bodies in all aspects of their decisions, policies and actions. Do any of the witnesses feel that should be broader? If it's manageable, what would people's views on that be? Jenny, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we feel like the function just doesn't go far enough. We feel that the language used in the Wales Act is far stronger. The current drawback of the way that it's currently worded in the bill, it just doesn't seem to have that strong emphasis on protecting the well-being of future generations, despite the title of the Commissioner role. So, I mean, in the Wales Act, they certainly go much further. They do talk about promoting, but then added to that, they also talk about the Commissioner acting as a guardian of the ability of future generations to meet their needs and encourage public bodies to take greater account of the long-term impact of the things that they do. That to us is a much is a much more strongly worded function that we think we would have benefit from in Scotland. We do think that there needs to be a stronger evidence in this bill in regard to the future generations element, because, I mean, even the way that well-being has been defined in the bill around those 6 entitlements, that seems to have more of a focus on current generations rather than on future generations. So if we're defining it in those rigid terms and then we're not being clear in the Commissioner's function about that future element, then I think it will just fall short.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else wish to come in? Yeah, Duncan.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that in terms of strengthening the wording. I think that's really important. I think that feeds into the whole practical policy implementation as well. What actually happens on the ground when you know, again, general issue which I talk about a lot, but in terms of the legislation, the clearer the legislation, the more specific it is, the more it's got kind of outcomes, the better that implementation is going to be in practice.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to come in? Or, I mean, some of the other questions are quite sort of similar. And in particular, I'm interested to know, we had some evidence suggesting that some of the powers feel a bit more that they're inquiries rather than investigations, so that sort of ability to actually investigate. I wonder whether anybody would have a view on that. Ellie,
I think an inquiry process would be generally more welcomed to strengthen the provisions. Again, fully agree with what colleagues have said. And I think it would also incentivise public bodies to ensure their decisions are made in accordance with the bill as far as they possibly can be.
Okay. I think, Emma, you were possibly going to come in.
Yeah, I think the investigation power set out in the draft, I think, largely mirrors the powers of our office, which we obviously do view as investigation powers. I'm not sure if I can offer much more comment in terms of what it should be, because that's more just a...
Yeah, I wonder then, just given that you've said that similar to your office, the bill allows the Commissioner to take such steps as the Commissioner considers appropriate when seeking to resolve a matter without recourse to an investigation. What would those steps look like, do you think?
I think I can only really speak for the Commissioner's office in terms of, for us, I think it largely depends on the issue. It can be sort of a letter seeking a particular outcome or some sort of assurance over a process. It might be requesting provision of information. It sort of varies by context and issue.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if MD has anything further in terms of what they see those steps as. No? I guess overall, what are the opportunities and challenges in terms of a Commissioner being required to keep under review the law, policy and practice related to wellbeing and sustainable development? Do people have views on that, on what the challenges might be?
I mean, resources are always a challenge, aren't there? So, I mean, the Commissioner would need to be properly resourced with an adequate team in place to ensure that the functions are fulfilled. Yeah, I mean, we don't really have any strong views about investigation versus inquiry. I suppose investigation potentially suggests that there's been some wrongdoing that's warranted the initiation of an investigation, whereas inquiry is maybe more knowledge gathering, a more general exercise. We haven't taken any issue with the details set out in the bill as to what the steps would be, so I think it just comes down to semantics, really. But I've got no other points to add.
No bother. That's helpful. Thank you. That bit inquiries versus investigation, that was quite helpful. Emma?
I mean, there's kind of practical challenges in any commissioner in terms of resources or prioritisation, etc. But just to briefly reiterate again, I think here that the major challenge would be the breadth of the wellbeing definition could cover a wide variety of different legal and policy issues, many of which would be covered by other bodies, including ourselves and SHRC.
Okay. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Carol. I was really interested with Carol's earlier question about the general function of the Commissioner to promote the well-being of future generations by promoting sustainable development by public bodies in all aspects of the decisions, policies and actions. And the reason I was quite interested in that was I think it was the comments from Emma Hunter about the possibility of overlap. Could there be a situation where the Children and Young People's Commissioner are looking at aspects of public bodies that don't meet some of those requirements? Or I think you mentioned the Scottish Human Rights Commission as well. So in terms of the functions of the Commissioner and that definition, I may be hinting at nothing here, but I just need to have a tangible example of where there could be an overlap. It would be helpful if you give me an actual, I know it's theoretical, it doesn't exist yet, but an example of where an overlap may actually occur in practice.
And sorry, could you possibly repeat the definition you were
So it says, to promote the well-being of future generations by promoting sustainable development by public bodies in all aspects of their decisions, policies and actions. So that's the overarching intention of why we would have the functions of the Commissioner as they're outlined in the bill. Can you see a situation where that definition and Carol's functions could overlap or rub against, if you like, the functions of another Commissioner or another body?
Definitely yes, in terms of, as I've noted, the wellbeing definition really covers a wide range of human rights. In terms of specific examples, I may not be able to give a specific example, but in terms of what we might be doing on kind of legislation, anything that's covering a wide range of children's rights issues and human rights issues, it would be kind of adding a layer to that, which is already, as I've said, sort of the responsibility of the Commissioner's Office and Scottish Human Rights Commission. There's also, potential for overlap in our investigation powers because, in part because of the breadth of that definition and in part because the investigation powers set out in this bill, as I understand, don't have actually the limitations that ours do in our own legislation, in that we are not able to carry out an investigation where it would, I'm sorry, I don't have the wording in front of me, but duplicate with the remit of another body, whereas this investigation power is not limited in that way.
Okay, so it would be helpful if you want to reflect on the question I'm asking and you want to come back with some written evidence. That would be very helpful as well. But I know it's quite difficult because we've got a bill which may come into statute and we're trying to look for concrete examples which by definition cannot exist, but examples of what could happen in the future would be very helpful. Now, I want to ask a little bit about the costs set out in the financial memorandum. And I get you're probably all here to talk about policy intent and how and your views on that, but we do have to ask about costs also. Now, from my notes, if I could read my handwriting, the establishment cost were about £800,000, running costs for the Commissioner about £1.2 million, running costs for the Commissioner in Wales is about £1.8 million as things stand. Any comments or reflections on on those costs, whether they're appropriate, too low, too high, value for money? I asked that last week. I don't think people were willing to comment on that. Emma, I suppose, and Duncan, I will take you first, but I was going to Emma on the basis that you're directly involved in in supporting the running of a commissioner's office. I will bring you in that as well, Emma. But Duncan, do you have any comments to make?
Yeah, I suppose to just come back to that point about the general commissioner landscape and the cost of that. I think the Finance Committee report said it was 16.6 million for the ones responsible directly to Parliament kind of thing. So there is an increasing cost over time of the commissioners in the commissioner landscape. So I think it's worth, I suppose, bearing that in mind as well. So we are talking here about setting up a new commissioner, and that will have its budget, as you mentioned. But it's like what savings could be made if we merge or bring together different commissioners which already exist. Particularly, sorry, there's a commissioner on the panel here, but particularly the Children's Commissioner and the Human Rights Commission, there is overlap there already, I think, already existing, and this would create, I guess, potentially more duplication and more overlap. So I think in that context, we could look at, there could be cost savings, not the cost of just setting up a brand new commissioner.
Can I nudge you a little bit more on that, Duncan? That's a very helpful answer, actually. But is there the possibility of attributing some of the responsibilities of the commissioner to be established out to existing commissioners and broaden their remits rather than set up a new commissioner at all?
I think that's a possibility, yeah. It's absolutely a possibility that those powers and responsibilities proposed in this bill could be sitting in the office of other commissioners, actually. I think that's a possibility, yeah.
And are there any other bodies that could reflect on this? So a lot of this will be about environmental standards. We'll get CEPA and Environmental Standards Scotland, for example. So you've got a pretty cluttered landscape in relation to this. Any other further reflections on that?
I think the three obvious ones which you've mentioned already are the Human Rights Commissioner, the Children's Commissioner, and this proposed Commissioner. For me, that seems to be the biggest overlap at the moment, those three. But obviously, yes, as you said, there will be other commissioners where there will be powers, responsibilities where there's overlap with them as well. So I think we do need that strategic review of the commissioner landscape just to really examine this and kind of plan it out a bit better, I think. I mean, one proposal which was made to me recently was you could have a Commissioner's Office for Scotland, which would be one body which is administrative, which would be about back office functions, HR, that kind of thing, and all the commissioners would feed into that as teams or whatever kind of thing. So you could have that one public body which underpins all the other commissioners.
I feel as if I'm targeting now, Mr. Forbes. I apologise for this, but can I push you further again? Because would it make sense or not to have that rationalisation of commissioners before we set up another commissioner? For example, we've just passed the land reform yesterday in the Parliament, and yes, that did create a new commissioner that's going to sit within an existing land commission in order to share back office functions and make some of those cost savings. So it's a chicken and egg thing. What should we do first, Mr. Thorpe?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think what the Finance Committee report was saying was we should do that review before we set anything else up. I think that's what that report actually said. So we should have that review. I think there was a kind of like, let's stop at this point. I think that's kind of what they'd said. Okay. And let's review before we set up other commissioners. Yeah. So.
Okay. Emma Hunter, did you want to reflect on any of that?
Yeah, I think sort of coming back to your original question, we don't have a comment on costs because, in our view, and with reference to the recommendations of the landscape review, we don't think there is a good case for a commissioner here. In terms of how sort of the duties in the bill could sit within the existing landscape. Again, as I've said, we don't think there's value in a wellbeing duty defined in this way because of the confusion created with human rights law. In terms of sustainable development duties, there's certainly value in consideration of that there, but you need to think about kind of the coherence. And I think in terms of kind of human rights commissioners taking on a sustainable development duty, we're not convinced that there's a clear connection, sort of a clear enough consideration of the options there, and particularly with regards to resources.
Okay, now I've got one final question, which I'm going to signpost because I want to bring Jane in for an RTPI specific question, but my final question will be, are there opportunities? Because if the Commissioner's Office works well and the Commissioner works well, could there be long-term cost savings? So I'll leave that hanging there. I'm going to ask all of you whether there's long-term cost savings in this as an investment. So comments on that would be helpful. But Jen, I didn't want to have you here and not ask you about pressures on local authorities and planning departments. And I suppose this theoretically anyway could be another pressure on local authority planning departments. So are they well placed to deal with this, whether it's a new responsibility or a clear statutory focus on an existing responsibility, if you like? Are there any financial implications for local authorities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from our point of view, certainly when we're thinking of costs, that's definitely what we're thinking about, is what are the potential cost implications going to be on local planning authorities who are under a lot of pressure at the moment in terms of their resources. And I mean, there's always a potential for this Commissioner role to provide support in future cost savings, but that very much depends on how the bill is taken forward. And it comes back to that point about policy cohesion. It comes back to that point about ensuring that the bill aligns and reinforces existing duties and work that's already being undertaken to promote sustainable development, to promote well-being. I mean, these things are deeply embedded in our National Planning Framework 4 already. So local planning authorities are already driving forward those objectives of NPF 4 and of the national outcomes. If this bill can be redrafted to align with that, then I think there is potential that it could be a positive step in terms of supporting local planning authorities in terms of what they're already doing, and provide useful oversight and acknowledge the work that's already being undertaken, and potentially to identify where things need to change and improve as well in a supportive and non-punitive manner. But as it's currently drafted, I think it could potentially have the opposite effect of creating additional parallel duties that would place additional resource pressures on local planning authorities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for answering both questions at the same time, which is very helpful. So what are the opportunities and potential longer-term cost savings for making this investment now? Any comments on that? Duncan Thorpe, and we'll go along. Duncan, Ellie, and then Emma. So Duncan first.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. I suppose it's not something we've mentioned already, but it is different to other commissioners in the sense that it's about a long-term view. It's about future generations. It's about saving public money if it's implemented effectively. I think that's a really important point to make, actually. So it is different in that sense. But again, I would say the aims, ambitions, objectives of the bill could be within other commissioners' office, as I've already said. But in terms of the principles, absolutely, I think it is unique. It is different in that sense compared to the other commissioners and what they do. So yeah, we're supportive of it in that sense, certainly.
Okay, thank you, Ellie.
Just to echo Duncan, really, and further to that, UKLA has no specific views on the financial implications.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. Emma?
I think similarly no views on the financial implications, and just as a result of the concerns we've already set out.
Okay. Can I thank all four of you? You're not finished yet, because as always, it would be remiss of me, Sarah Boyack has been the member in charge of the bill, sat patiently through all of this, and I know she'll be bursting to ask you lots of questions, and we've got a wee bit of time, so I'll pass you now to Sarah Boyack.
Thanks, Convener. I know we don't have unlimited time. It's been very helpful getting your reflections on the bill, particularly in terms of areas where you think the bill could be amended or strengthened. And I was going to go back to that. The definitions issues in the proposal, that the concept was having a public duty definitions and then a commissioner, so a sort of logical approach. And sitting alongside that, we've had the Scottish Government's proposals, which they've now pulled back on. So I'm interested in your comments about potential alignment between National Performance Framework and the duties in this bill, because they haven't been met, but there's that issue of accountability and how you increase awareness. Do you think that would be something that would strengthen the bill? It's something I'm prepared to consider. Jenny, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, no, we absolutely think it's critical that there be alignment between this bill and the National Performance Framework and the national outcomes, particularly, you know, the national outcomes are under review, the NPF is under review, and we think that that work needs to be carried out in alignment with this bill and vice versa. They need to work together. Otherwise, what are we doing? the national outcomes and the national performance framework is widely considered to be our well-being framework in Scotland. So surely that should be the starting point for how we define well-being, if we're defining it at all.
Yeah. Duncan, do you want to come in?
Yes, I completely agree with that. I'd say that alignment does make absolute sense, but I would say let's look at other policy areas as well, because I think in policy in general there's a lack of alignment. So, as I mentioned before, the Community Wealth Building Bill as well, there's certainly big overlap there as well, and I'm sure other bits of legislation like land reform, for example. So let's just make sure that there is this alignment. But yeah, absolutely, specifically in terms of the National Performance Framework, that's the most obvious one, I suppose.
Yeah, and we've got the Natural Environment Bill in terms of
Yeah.
biodiversity. We're passing legislation all the time. It's that policy coherence that I think comes through very strongly, so I'll definitely reflect on that. Do Ellie or Emma have any comments on that?
Just in agreement.
Right, Emma?
I think, as kind of mentioned earlier, we definitely support consideration of how sustainable development could be strengthened through consideration on the National Performance Framework. And as I say, it really depends on how sustainable development is defined and tied to any kind of additional wellbeing duty in the bill. If it was to be looking more concretely at a sustainable development duty and tying that to National Performance Framework, we can see it be worthy of consideration.
Thank you. The other thing I was going to ask about was the potential of the Commissioner, and I'm very conscious of the fact we do have about 131 public bodies in Scotland, so that issue of advice and guidance, if we are raising the bar and expecting not just warm words but action, and your reflections on the how due regard to really helpful, but that issue about advice, guidance and investigations, the extent to which things are changing, but if you have that opportunity for support to those organisations, does that work in terms of, will that make the difference? You've talked about somebody needs to do it, and I'd suggest to the Future Generations Commissioner, any reflections on that? I'm partly saying it, Jenny, as an ex-planner, because the world has totally changed since I was a planner. I taught planners, and it's that thing about how do you keep up in terms of sustainable development with technological change, with science, with what's happening in the planet. I was thinking of as a resource for different organisations. Is that something that would relate to people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Commissioner role certainly does have the potential to be a really useful support. I think it depends how it's taken forward, the resources that are given to it. If an office is created rather than it just being on one individual person, and I mean, like you say, there are so many public bodies that deal with such a vast range of matters related and which link with well-being. I think one of the challenges, and this is going back possibly to a previous question that was asked about challenges of the role, would be to ensure that it covers all of those areas equally. And I think from conversations that I've had, and I don't have any concrete evidence to back this up, but from conversations that I've had with people in Wales about the Wales Commissioner is that sometimes the impact that the role can have can depend on who is in the role and what their particular area of interest is and what their focus is. So it would be about giving that a bit of consideration. I think I don't know what the answer is necessarily, but I think that could certainly be a challenge. But at the same time, depending on how it's taken forward, it could be a very useful support as well.
Thanks. Duncan, do you want to come in?
Can you just read with the question again, sorry, just to
Well,
clarify.
just given the range of public bodies and the urgency of implementing sustainable development and having a more joined-up approach to policy coherence, the Christie Commission is nearly 15 years ago, and we didn't take that forward. So it's thinking about that policy coherence, the potential of a commissioner to actually really support the range of organisations for whom sustainable development or wellbeing are not on their agenda.
Yeah, I do think potentially, I think it could be some kind of like umbrella kind of body in that sense as well, feeding into other organisations and influencing them and helping them implement their duties, etc. I think that is, I think there's definitely a case for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Ellie, do you have any thoughts?
Not just echoing Duncan there. Yeah, thanks.
Emma? No, okay. And the issue about the alternative options, the Carnegie report did give a range of different thoughts. You know, things like having a conveners forum in the Parliament to ask MSPs to do this work. Audit Scotland, I did speak to Audit Scotland, and they would need resource because it's not in their capacity at the moment, or a government-appointed advisory council, independent round table. Any thoughts on those alternatives? And the benefits and disbenefits of having a commissioner as a different way of doing it? No? Okay. I could probably ask questions all day, convener, but that might not be tactically smart.
You can have one more if you want.
Just going back to the future savings issue, about how you support organisations and enable them to be more efficient and have that joined up thinking approach. I don't know if any of you have got any thoughts on that.
I guess I suppose in terms of that, you know, we're talking about early intervention and prevention here, and you know, long-term planning basically, which isn't often the case, obviously. So I think in terms of our sector, for example, that's the way we think as well. So I think it certainly aligns with that long-term thinking. So I think that's one of the strengths of this commissioner as well. Would be, you know, it gets beyond the kind of election cycles, which, you know, we're working in the same systems basically, and they're short-term systems kind of thing. So I think it does kind of like square that circle in a way. So I don't know if that answers the question or not really. But
Yeah, no, just thinking about that, it's partly an invest to save, but it's partly the nature of climate change that is now happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an investment. I think in terms of the aims and objectives of the bill, that's an investment in terms of that purpose. Yeah, definitely. It's a long-term investment.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I think it extends beyond an investment. I think it's vital. Yeah. To protect the well-being of future generations. Like you said, we are in a critical moment where we're in a climate emergency and biodiversity crisis, so we do need to be taking actions to protect and to think long-term for the future people of Scotland.
I was just thinking about those organisations that are under financial pressure and you're asking them to do something more, so the idea about having a duty, so it raises it up their agenda, but also actually supporting them by providing advice and guidance to actually enable them to do to implement change that actually will be beneficial, but it wouldn't be on their agenda. That was the concept. Okay. Yep. Anyone else? Emma?
I mean, just briefly, really, to reiterate what I've said previously, which is we definitely support consideration of options to embed sustainable development in policy development in Scotland. We just don't think the Commissioner is the correct approach, both in terms of kind of consideration of options elsewhere and in terms of it being a kind of...
So going back to that, what would be your alternatives to actually look at the sustainable development principles for those 131 authorities? What would be your alternative approach?
I think on that, I think we would defer to organisations working more concretely on sustainable development. It's really just to reiterate that in our view, in this bill, a commissioner which looks at wellbeing and sustainable development has too much overlap and isn't necessary. And but we do support the kind of principles of looking to embed sustainable development across public bodies.
Mm-hmm. And would a memorandum of understanding be an appropriate way to approach in terms of both the Children's Commissioner, the looking at the human rights angle? It's certainly an issue I've discussed with Audit Scotland. They don't have the capacity, but the idea of having a memorandum of understanding so you're clear about whose priorities are what, so that you don't overlap.
I think I couldn't comment on that specifically, but I think that a lot of the overlap is created by the issues I've raised with the wellbeing definition in the bill, and I think that that's quite a significant area.
Okay, Duncan.
There's maybe like a reframing job to be done here in terms of the language. So when we think about commissioners, we maybe think of enforcement as well, I think, automatically. But as you said, it's not that approach. It's about helping and assisting, you know, public bodies and others to do their jobs better, and not saying, here's another duty for you to enforce kind of thing. So I think if we reframe it in that sense as well, it does give it a very different flavour, I think, as a commissioner. So.
Thanks. And then Jenny.
Yeah, just to say I would agree with that. I mean, I think we shouldn't be placing additional duties on public bodies because they should already be doing a lot of this anyway, and I think they are. And I think if we're creating a commissioner role, that should be that supportive role to help them do it better and to make sure that they're meeting their obligations and duties that already exist rather than piling on an additional layer.
Right. Thank you very much. I sneaked in that extra question. Thank you, Convener.
I did notice, Sarah, but I wasn't going to say anything. Can I thank all the witnesses for your time this morning? It's been very, very helpful for the committee. Can I ask you to stay seated for a moment while we dispose of one more agenda item, which will be very brief before we move into private sessions? If you could just stay where you are for a moment, that would be very helpful. We move to agenda item 3. So our next item of business is consideration of a Scottish statutory instrument, the Council Tax Reduction Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland No. 5 Regulations 2025. And this instrument is subject to the negative procedure. Do members have any comments on the instrument? No. Mr Balfour, just for a moment, I thought you did. So therefore, I would, in that case, I would invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to the instrument. Are members content with that approach to the instrument? Okay, thank you. And that does conclude our public business for the day, and we'll now move into private session. Thank you.